Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 145th deck and it's titled a Nightmarish Bouncy Ball. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week though, our random card was suggested to us by ModsFlair8683 over on YouTube, and that card is Umbris Fear Manifest. So Umbris is 3 blue, black for a 1/1 Nightmare Horror. Umbris gets +1/+1 for each card your opponents own in exile, and whenever Umbris or another Nightmare or Horror enters the battlefield under your control, target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a land card. Now, a bit of an unspoken rule on the channel is that if we ever get a legendary creature or a legal commander as our random card of the week, then obviously we've got to play it as the commander, because how else can we truly build around a card? So Umbris is going to be in our command zone this week, and one of the biggest things that really drew me to this is that it wants us to really play around with nightmares and horrors, but if I'm being perfectly honest, I've actually done a nightmare deck and a horror deck in the past, and I didn't really want to repeat myself too much. So instead, I focused on the fact that it's whenever it or another nightmare or horror enters the battlefield. So we can kind of play around with that and make sure that we're triggering that ability as many times as possible. And some of the ways that we're going to be doing that is with our first theme of the week, which is blink effects. And I'm going to be perfectly honest up front, I'm not 100% sure the difference between blink and flicker. I believe blink is that it exiles and comes back right away. Flicker is exiles and comes back at the end of turn. If I'm wrong on that, please correct me, but I may accidentally interchange the two as we go through this. But a good example of what I'm talking about is with Essence Flux, which is a blue mana for an instant. Exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it's a spirit, put a +1/+1 counter on it. There's not really spirit synergies in here for Essence Flux, but it is 1 mana to exile a creature and return it to play, meaning we get its enter the battlefield effect again. If that's Umbris, we get to exile the top of an opponent's library until they hit a land, and then we get to cast Essence Flux and do it again. So that means that we can kind of get out of hand with some of our enter the battlefield effects, and that also triggers, specifically when we're talking about Umbris, of course, that also triggers when we cast other nightmares and horrors. So because of that, we of course have to play nightmares and horrors. This is not intended to be a full Kindred nightmare or Kindred horror deck, but it does have a lot of those creatures with enter the battlefield effects to make sure that we can take advantage of our first theme in blinking or flickering them. And a good example of that is with Grell Philosopher, which is 2 and a blue for a 1/4 horror wizard. It has Aberrant Tinkering when Grell Philosopher enters the battlefield, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each horror you control gains all activated abilities of target artifact an opponent controls until the end of turn. You may spend blue mana as though it were mana of any color to activate those abilities. Now, the actual enter the battlefield effect on the Grell Philosopher isn't always going to be the best. There will be times when it's not super useful or our opponents don't really have any artifacts, specifically ones with activated abilities. But it is worth mentioning that it triggers something when it enters the battlefield, meaning that if we cast Essence Flux on the Philosopher, we can actually get its ability again and then also trigger Umbris at the same time. So that's kind of what the goal of the deck is just to get a ton of value from enter the battlefield effects with a focus on horrors, nightmares, and of course our commander. So with all of that being said though, we come to our final theme of the deck, which is going to be doubling up our enter the battlefield effects. And there are a couple of unique ways that we can double them up, but the most obvious way is with Panharmonicon, which is 4 mana for an artifact. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This is kind of the go-to card for a lot of strategies that involve enter the battlefield effects. We've definitely played it before. I'm sure we'll play it again. But the general idea is that it literally doubles all of our effects. That can then kind of quadruple if we have something like Essence Flux and a Horror or Umbris. That's also going to give us the ability to double pretty much anything that's going on, because if you notice, it says an artifact or creature entering causes a triggered ability of a permanent we control. That does not need to be a permanent entering under our control. It just has to be the ability triggering under our control. So if for some reason our opponents have something going on that then triggers our stuff, we still get to double up on it. And there are other ways to double up on what's happening here. It's not just Panharmonicon, but this is going to be one of the most obvious effects in the deck. So, with all of that being said, let's move on to some of our key cards. And these are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do and are incredible value pieces, and in most cases, honestly, going to be one of the biggest reasons why we might win a game. So with that being said, the first of our key cards is going to be Aboleth Spawn. So Aboleth Spawn is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 fish horror, has flash and ward 2, and whenever a creature entering the battlefield under an opponent's control causes a triggered ability of that creature to trigger, you may copy that ability and you may choose new targets for the copy. Since we have so many cards that double enter the battlefield effects, this is technically an enter the battlefield effect, so it would be doubled by Panharmonicon, even though it's not our creature entering the battlefield. That's why it's very important wording on what some of these cards say. But Aboleth Spawn is going to be letting us double up on our opponents' enter the battlefield effects. So no matter what our opponents are doing, we're able to kind of sneak through and get a little bit of extra value out of their stuff, and ideally put us in a position where they don't really want to play enter the battlefield effects, because we can copy them and possibly get even more triggers out of them. So Aboleth Spawn is kind of sneaky powerful, especially because it's 3 mana for a flash 2/3, meaning that the first time we copy an effect with this, it's pretty much just gonna be free. Our opponents don't know it's coming, they're not prepared for it. We might be able to get something very, very strong. Even afterwards, it has ward 2, so if our opponents are trying to kill it before playing their enter the battlefield creatures, they have to pay 2 more mana to do it, meaning this thing is probably going to be sticking around for a while, so it definitely deserves a spot in our key cards. Next up, though, is a card that looks a little bit different, and that is going to be Uchulan. I believe I'm saying that correctly. If I'm not, please correct me. But Uchulan is 3 and a black for a star 4 crab ooze horror, and its power is equal to the number of crabs, oozes, and or horrors you control, and it has horrific symbiosis. At the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target creature card from an opponent's graveyard. If you do, create a token that's a copy of Uchulan. Because of the way that this ability is worded, this can get out of hand very, very quickly. It's essentially exponential. We have 1 Uchulan that turns into 2, that turns into 4, that turns into 8, 16, and so on and so on. At some point, this gets out of hand for our opponents to have to deal with, but even more importantly, because it's creating this many token copies of it, we are actually able to then trigger our commander with all of the tokens that are being made. So if we make 4 Uchulans, we get 4 Umbris triggers, and that can close out games very quickly, especially if we've had more up to that point, or we're doubling our enter the battlefield effects, or maybe we just have some blink effects in play. So with that, Uchulan definitely also earns a spot as a key card. But our final key card here is going to look a little bit strange, if I'm being perfectly honest, because I don't think it's a card that sees a lot of play, and that is Mirror of Life Trapping. So Mirror of Life Trapping is 4 mana for an artifact. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, if it was cast, exile it, then return all other permanent cards exiled with Mirror of Life Trapping to the battlefield under their owner's control. This is, for all intents and purposes, kind of a delayed Panharmonicon, because the creature has to enter the battlefield, then it gets exiled, then everything under the mirror comes back into play. So if, for example, we cast an Aboleth Spawn, It comes in, we trigger its enter the battlefield effect if it were to have one. It then gets exiled, we cast in a Chulon, it comes into play. We again trigger its enter the battlefield effect if it has one. Then it's exiled, and Aboleth's Spawn comes back into play, triggering its enter the battlefield effect again. Again, purely hypothetical. I know neither of these two creatures have enter the battlefield effects, but bear with me on that one. But the idea is that it's doubling up because our creatures are literally entering the battlefield twice. And the only real downside to this is that it does trigger on everybody's creatures. It's not just us, it's our opponents as well. But ideally, we'll be in a situation to make much more use out of it than our opponents will. So those are our key cards for this week, and the next thing we got to do is talk about some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize very well together, and in some cases are just kind of cool, cool interactions. They're a lot of fun to talk about, and I think they're very unique. So the first of them, though, I'm not going to lie to you, not super unique because I've talked about this in previous videos. It is Narumeha Master Wizard and Ghostly Flicker. This is my personal favorite mono blue infinite combo, and as you can tell by looking at the cards, it's probably because it's only 32 cents for Narumeha and 25 cents for Ghostly Flicker to be able to generate infinite mana and infinite enter the battlefield effects. And the way that that's actually going to work is that if we have Narumeha Master Wizard in our hand and another creature in play, or honestly, we don't even need the other creature with Ghostly Flicker because it targets artifacts, creatures, and or lands. So we would have Narumeha in our hand. We'd pay the 2 blue for our 3/3 human wizard. She does have flash, so we could do this at instant speed. When she enters the battlefield, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. She also gives other wizards +1/+1. That's probably not going to be relevant for us, but it is there just in case. So we're going to cast her after casting Ghostly Flicker, which is 2 and a blue for an instant. Exile 2 target artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control, then return them to the battlefield under your control. If we can pull this off, we've cast Ghostly Flicker. With it on the stack, we flash in Narumeha. She comes in and copies the Ghostly Flicker. The new copy of Ghostly Flicker can target anything else we want, and Narumeha. So that will resolve. Narumeha will come back into play, see the original Ghostly Flicker still on the stack, copy it again, and we have now copied it an infinite number of times, always blinking a second thing as well. Because of the way that Ghostly Flicker is worded, that second thing could be a land, which in between all of the blinking will get tapped for mana, making infinite mana, or it could be a creature with an enter the battlefield effect. Maybe something as simple as making each opponent lose a life. Each opponent loses infinite life, and we win the game. So these two cards combined are very, very powerful, and honestly, they're both really good in this deck without each other. But I'm a big fan of having at least one infinite combo in the deck, even if it's not something you can tutor for, just kind of sitting around, because I'm a firm believer that at some point, the game's gotta end, and while it may not be very fun for some people to have it end this way, it is something that at least closes out the game in some cases where we may not be able to otherwise. So I think with all of that being said, it does deserve a spot in our cool interactions, and I wanted to highlight it because, again, this is my personal favorite mono blue combo, and it's less than $1. So if you don't put this into your decks, I would highly recommend it. It is very powerful and definitely deserves to be in most mono blue decks. And I know we're not mono blue, but still works out. Moving on to our next cool interaction, though. This is one that I personally have tried to pull off in some personal decks quite a few times and have not pulled it off. It's actually another infinite combo, this time though between Omniscience and Acererak the Archlich. So Omniscience, 7 blue for an enchantment that simply says you may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. And a huge shout out to Wilds of Eldraine for dipping the price of this card to about $5. Very awesome to be able to play it in some of our budget decks. And then we're going to partner that up though with Acererak the Archlich, which is 2 and a black for a 5/5 legendary creature zombie wizard. When Acererak the Archlich enters the battlefield, If you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, return a Sararak the Archlich to its owner's hand and venture into the dungeon. Then, whenever it attacks, for each opponent, you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token unless that player sacrifices a creature. So, the main thing we are trying to do here is actually not use a Sararak to go through the Tomb of Annihilation, because as soon as we do that, he can't return to our hand. With Omniscience in play, we don't have to spend mana on a Sararak, so we can cast him, venture into the dungeon, return him to our hand, and then cast him again for free an infinite number of times, venturing into the dungeon an infinite number of times. Luckily, one of the dungeons has a room that just says each opponent loses 1 life. So as soon as we can go infinite with a Sararak, we can drain out the entire table by infinitely looping some dungeons. I will also be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure which dungeon that is. I probably should have prepared that beforehand, but hey, we're here now, so all you need to know is that it does win the game. So I know that I might get a little bit of heat for putting in a couple of infinite combos in here, especially in a deck that plays very similarly to a control deck, but that is a good way to end the game when a lot of times our creatures may not be able to close it out. But if you're not a big fan of that one, Umbris will typically get very, very large and can close out the game in just a couple of swings, so there are plenty of ways for this deck to win. Now, with all of that being said, we do have to move into the price of the deck, and this week, the price of the deck came out to $92.07, so it's very, very close to our budget limit, and a good portion of that actually comes from our Commander, which is the most expensive card in the entire deck. However, a close second, and the card that I figured we'd talk about, is Thassa Deep Dwelling. So Thassa Deep Dwelling is 3 and a blue for a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god. She's indestructible. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. And at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 other target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Then you can also pay 3 and a blue to tap another target creature. This is going to be another card along the lines of Panharmonicon, which I know sounds weird because nowhere on here does it say that you double enter the battlefield effects, but because at the end of your turn, every single turn, you get to exile a creature and return it to play, you are technically doubling up on at least 1 enter the battlefield effect every single turn. And this is a very, very powerful card. There's been a lot of times where I get this out on turn 4 and it just kind of slowly grinds out a victory because it's very difficult for our opponents to deal with. An indestructible enchantment that can sometimes also just be a 6/5 is very difficult for a lot of decks to handle because you have to exile it or there's really no other way to get rid of it. So I think Thassa definitely deserves a spot in the deck, and if you do unfortunately need to cut it, it's not going to completely ruin the deck. The deck can still function without it, but if you can afford to keep it in the deck, I would highly recommend it. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit out of our budget, and a card that I would recommend replacing it with, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So this week, the card that I think could really improve this deck is another blink option in Sword of Hearth and Home. And Sword of Hearth and Home is especially unique because not only does it count as blinking our creatures, but it actually also ramps at the same time. So Sword of Hearth and Home is 3 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from green and from white. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then search your library for a basic land card, put both cards onto the battlefield under your control, then shuffle, and it equips for 2. So essentially what this is going to do for us is blink one of our creatures, but also let us search our library for a land and put it into play, ramping us at the same time. There's really not a better card that we could ask for, considering we're in Dimir. We don't ramp super well, plus we want the blink effect, and it means that we can be attacking, and the protection from green and white sometimes might just be enough for Umbris to get through and just kind of start knocking people out of the game. Because if something has protection from green and white, it can't be blocked by those creatures, and Umbris really benefits from not being blocked. However, if we are putting in Sword of Hearth and Home, we need to take a card out. And the card I would recommend taking out is Supernatural Stamina. And the reason I would recommend Supernatural Stamina, which, by the way, is 1 black mana for an instant, until the end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains, when this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. This is one of the few cards like this that doesn't do as much as we want it to do. We have a lot of other cards like this in the deck to protect Umbris or to protect some other cards, so if someone kills it, we can just get it back. But this one doesn't give any permanent benefit. We have other versions of this that give +1/+1 counters, that give it an aura attached to it, that also maybe just return it to play untapped. Because this only gets +2/+0 and then also returns tapped, it's really kind of a miss on a lot of different levels, and it is still in here because it can still be useful, but I do think having an extra blink effect plus ramp would probably be better long term. So that is my suggestion for our budget for this deck. Now, before we get into actually testing this deck out and seeing what it looks like in a game, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. I won't take too long, it's all up on the screen if you're interested. It's also all down in the description of the video, so you can check that out. But if you are looking to join our amazing patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard, then you can of course head on over to patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide or right here on YouTube as a channel member. You'll get a ton of amazing benefits, not least of which is being able to play in some of the games and appear on the channel, which, speaking of, leads us directly into our game. So let's talk about our opponents, because this week we actually have several of our patrons appearing in the game. So first up, we have Minthara, who is being played by Cow. He is not one of our patrons, but still an amazing guy, and I love playing games with him. We have Storvald, Frost Giant Jarl, which is being played by Richard, our newest patron. And we have Medomai the Ageless, which is being played by Luke or Salty and Sunshine. So if you would also like to appear in any of these games, do feel free to check us out on Patreon or as a channel member, and you can get the chance to be here as well. But with that being said, let's talk about some of our opponent's decks and see what we're up against. So first up, like I said, Minthara Merciless Soul, being played by Cow. This is a token style deck, but it also, you'll notice, is going to have a slight enchantment sub-theme, because he actually built it to focus on both Minthara and Daxos the Returned, which is going to be the other black-white experience counter commander. So he really wants to make sure that he's building up a token army and then giving them +1/+0 for each experience counter, ideally making a ton of experience counters, because there's also going to be a sacrifice theme in here as well. I've played against this deck a couple of times. It really does push out a lot of power very, very quickly, so I am excited to see what it can do. Next up, we have Richard appearing in his first game on the channel, playing Storvald Frost Giant Jarl. And of course, if he's appearing in his first game on the channel, he needed to make a big impact, so he brought out banding. And the entire goal of this deck is to make sure that he can band his creatures together to kind of cause some combat shenanigans. He wants to put some lures on his creatures to make sure that they have to be blocked, or force his opponents to block creatures that really don't want to be blocked. Well, don't want to be blocked by his opponents, definitely do want to be blocked by him. Things that gain control of creatures, things that destroy creatures, and just kind of generally messing with combat in a way that banding allows, that most of the time the rules don't really like. So I am very excited to see this deck. I've actually never seen Storvald in play or a banding deck in play, so I am very, very excited. And then finally, we have Luke playing Medomai the Ageless. And this commander does look very terrifying up front. It does take extra turns. He did mention that this is pretty much the only card in the entire deck that takes extra turns. But the way that he built the deck was actually very interesting, because he said that what he did is he went to the EDH rec page for Metomai, took out all the cards that cost more than $1, and then just built the deck out of the remaining cards. So all the cards in here should be less than $1, and they were all pulled directly from what people thought should go in a Metomai deck. So I think that's a super cool way to build a deck, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how it plays. But let me know down in the comments which of these opponents you think might be the toughest for our deck to take on. I am a little nervous with how much white there is at the table, because white typically means exile removal, and we're not super prepped for that one, but we'll see how it goes. I hope you all enjoy the game. I hope you already enjoyed the deck tech. If you did, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. But let's jump into the game, see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Cow goes first, followed by Richard, myself, and then Luke. On Cow's first turn, he plays a Scoured Barrens, gaining a life. Richard plays a Seaside Citadel. I play an Island. Luke plays a Glacial Floodplain. Cow plays a Plains and casts Orzhov Signet. Richard plays a Forest and casts Nature's Lore, searching his library for a forest and putting it into play. I play a Temple of Deceit, scrying 1. Luke plays an Island and casts Azorius Signet. Cow casts Daxos the Returned, getting an experience counter whenever he casts an enchantment, and also letting him pay 3 mana to make a spirit token with power and toughness equal to the number of experience counters he has. Then he plays an Orzhov Basilica, returning a Plains to his hand. Richard plays a Plains and casts Tocasia's Welcome, drawing a card once a turn when a creature with mana value 3 or less enters the battlefield under his control. I play a Swamp and cast Mesmeric Fiend, making Luke reveal his hand when it enters, and then letting me exile a non-land card from his hand until the Fiend leaves the battlefield, this time exiling Kangi Sky Warden. On Luke's turn, he plays a Deserted Beach, then casts Flaming Fist, giving his commander double strike when it attacks. Cow casts a Hidden Stockpile, letting him pay 1 mana to sacrifice a creature and scry 1, then he also makes a 1/1 servo token in his end step if a permanent he controlled left the battlefield this turn. This also triggers Daxos, giving Cow an experience counter, then he casts Talisman of Hierarchy, plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and attacks Luke for 2 with Daxos. On Richard's turn, he casts Tangle Asp, destroying any creature at the end of combat that blocked or was blocked by the Asp. This triggers Tocasia's Welcome, drawing him a card. He then casts Baton of Morale, which allows him to pay 2 mana to give a creature banding until the end of turn. I play a Plains and cast Thassa Deep Dwelling, letting me exile a creature I control at the end of my turn, then return it to play. Then I attack Cow for 1, and in my end step, I exile Mesmeric Fiend, giving Kangi back to Luke, and looking at Richard's hand, exiling a Trophy Mage instead. Luke plays a Plains and casts Kangi Sky Warden, giving his flying creatures +2/+0 whenever Kangi attacks, and +0/+2 whenever Kangi blocks. Cow plays a Plains and casts his commander, Minthara Merciless Soul, getting an experience counter at the end of his turn if a creature died that turn, and also giving his creatures +1/+0, and it has Ward 1 for each experience counter he has. He then attacks me for 3 with Daxos. Richard casts a Trinket Mage, searching his library for an artifact that cost 1 or less, in this case Soul Ring, putting it into his hand and then casting it. I play an Island and cast my commander Umbris, Fear Manifest, which gets +1/+1 for each card my opponents own in exile, and making target opponent exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a land whenever a horror or nightmare enters under my control. With this trigger, I target Cow, who exiles 1 card. I then moved my end step, exiling Umbris, returning it to play, targeting Cow again, this time exiling 3. Luke plays a Secluded Step and casts Empyrean Eagle, giving his other flying creatures +1/+1. He then foretells a card and attacks me for 6 with Kangi. At the end of turn, Cow activates Daxos, making a 1/1 spirit token. Cow plays a Caves of Koilos and casts Adeline Resplendent Cathar, which gets +X/+0, where X is the number of creatures he controls, and also makes an attacking 1/1 human for each opponent whenever he attacks. He then attacks Richard for 2 with the Spirit, creating a 1/1 human tapped and attacking each opponent. Luke and I block the human attacking us, killing them but taking no damage, while Richard doesn't block, taking 4. Then at the end of turn, Cow makes a 1/1 servo and gets an experience counter since he had a creature die under his control this turn. Richard casts Keldoran Warrior, which has banding, drawing a card when it enters, then plays Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. In response, Cow casts Deep Gnome Terramancer, letting him search his library for basic planes, putting it into play tapped since an opponent had a land enter under their control without being played. Richard then casts Tolarian Entrancer, letting him gain control of each creature that blocks it at the end of combat. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Cow for 6 with Umbris, but he blocks with the servo, taking no damage. Then at the end of turn, I exile Umbris, returning it to play, targeting Luke and having him exile 4 cards from the top of his library. Luke plays a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1, and casts his foretold spell Raven Form, exiling Adeline, letting Cow make a 1/1 bird token instead. He then attacks Cow for 4 with the Empyrean Eagle and me for 6 with Kangi. Cow blocks the Eagle with his newly acquired bird token, which is a 3/1 thanks to Minthara, killing both creatures while I take 6. Then at the end of turn, Cow activates Daxos, making another spirit. On Cow's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Touch the Spirit Realm, exiling Umbris when it enters and also getting another experience counter. He moves to combat, attacking me for 4 with a human, and attacks Luke and Richard each for 6 with a spirit. Before the blocks, Richard uses Baton of Morale to give banding to Tangle Asp, using it and Trinket Mage to block as a band. This lets him block the spirit, assigning all combat damage to the Trinket Mage, killing it but also killing Cow's spirit while leaving his Asp alive. Then Luke and I both take the damage, and at the end of Cow's turn, he gets another experience counter and a servo. Richard casts his commander, Stormvald's Frost Giant Jarl, giving all his creatures Ward 3, and letting him give target creature base power and toughness 7/7, and give target creature base power 1/1 until the end of turn, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, this time making the Entrancer a 7/7. He then attacks me for 7 with the Entrancer, and I block with Mesmeric Fiend, killing it and giving Richard his Trophy Mage. Cast Gonti, Lord of Luxury, looking at the top 4 cards of target opponent's library when it enters, exiling a card from among them face down, and letting me cast it using mana of any color. This has me exiling an Erebos Bleak-Hearted from Cow's library. Then I move to my end step, exiling Gonti with Thassa, returning him to play, this time exiling Sphinx's Revelation from Luke's library. Notably, due to the limitations of playing over webcam, we revealed the cards with Gonti, but normally they would be hidden. On Luke's turn, he plays an island and casts his commander Medomai the Ageless, which lets Luke take an additional turn after this one whenever Medomai deals combat damage to an opponent, but it can't attack on extra turns. At the end of turn, Cow activates Daxos twice, making 2 more spirits. Then on Cow's turn, he attacks Luke for 30 with his 3 spirits and the Deep Gnome Terramancer, me for 5 with the servo, and Richard for 5 with the human. Richard blocks the human with Stormvald, killing it and taking no damage. I don't block, taking 5, and Luke blocks one of the spirits with Kangi, killing it but only taking 22. Then in Cow's second main phase, he casts Master of Ceremonies, and in his end step makes another servo and gets an experience counter. On Richard's turn, he casts Jangling Automaton, which untaps all of the defending player's creatures whenever it attacks, also drawing a card with Takasia's Welcome. On my turn, I move straight to my end step, exiling Gonti, returning it to play and targeting Cow, exiling Haunted Library. Luke casts Azor the Lawbringer, preventing each opponent from casting instants or sorceries during their next turn. He then attacks Cal with Metamai, which gains double strike thanks to the Flaming Fist, hitting him for a total of 8 damage across 2 hits, triggering Metamai twice, so Luke gets to take 2 additional turns after this one. On his first extra turn, Luke plays a Sky Cloud Expanse and attacks Cal for 6 with Azor, activating his ability for X equals 6 on attacks to draw 6 cards and gain 6 life. In response, Richard casts Return of the Wild Speaker, drawing 7 cards since he controls a creature with 7 power. On Luke's second extra turn, he casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, then plays an island and casts Open the Armory, searching his library for an equipment or aura, putting it into his hand. This lets him get Frogify, immediately casting it to enchant Daxos, turning him into a 1/1 frog with no abilities. In response, Cal activates Daxos, making another spirit token, then the Frogify resolves, and Luke moves to combat, attacking Cal for 6 with Azor. In Cal's upkeep, Master of Ceremonies triggers, making each of his opponents choose to draw a card, making a 1/1 citizen token, or make a treasure token, while Cal gets to do the same. This has Richard drawing a card, Luke making a citizen, and I make a treasure, so Cal gets all 3. Still in his upkeep, he sacrifices the newly acquired citizen to Hidden Stockpile, scrying 1, then plays a swamp and attacks Luke for 52 damage with 4 spirit tokens, Daxos and the Terramancer, and also attacks Richard for 12 with his 2 servos. Before blocks, Luke flashes in Errant and Giada, letting him look at the top card of his library and cast spells with flash or flying from the top of his deck. Still before blocks, Luke casts Condemn, putting one of Cal's attacking spirits onto the bottom of his library, gaining Cal 5 life. Then he's able to block the remaining 3 spirits, killing all 3 of his own creatures, but only taking 15 damage, surviving at just 2 life, while Richard blocks a servo with Stormvald, killing it and taking 6. In Cal's second main phase, he casts Wedding Announcement, letting him put a counter on it and make a human token in his end step, or draw a card if he attacked with 2 or more creatures, transforming when it has 3 or more counters. Finally, in his end step, he makes a servo, draws a card, and gets an experience counter. Richard plays a Sky Cloud Expanse and casts Decanter of Endless Water, gaining no maximum hand size. He also casts Noble Quarry, enchanting Tolarian Entrancer, giving it +1/+1 and forcing each creature defending player controls to block it if able. He moves to combat, attacking Cal with the Entrancer and the Keldoran Warrior, creating a band, and also with Jangling Automaton, untapping all of Cal's creatures. He also attacks Luke for 7 with Stormvald, knocking him out of the game. Then Cal is forced to block the Entrancer with all his creatures and takes 7 from the Automaton. Rather than having Richard gain control of all of his creatures though, Cal sacrifices them all except his spirits to Hidden Stockpile, scrying 1 a total of 6 times. Before Luke dies to combat damage, I cast Sphinx's Revelation for X equals 3, gaining 3 life, drawing 3 cards. Finally, Richard assigns combat damage to his warrior, killing it, gaining control of Cal's 3 spirits that die immediately since he has no experience counters. On my turn, I cast Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths, letting Cal look at the top 3 cards of my library, separating them into a face-up pile and a face-down pile, then I choose one to put to my hand and the other to my graveyard. This ends with me putting the face-up pile of Command Tower and Swamp into my hand, and the face-down pile of Consuming Aberration into my graveyard. Notably, this is difficult to do over webcam, but we managed by having me look away and my opponents telling me where to put each card. I then play a Command Tower and cast Spellskite, letting me pay a blue mana or 2 life to redirect a spell or ability to itself, and in my end step I exile Atris with Thassa's ability, this time letting Richard look at the top 3 cards of my library, and I choose to put the face down pile of a Swamp and Flesh Writher into my hand, and the face up pile of a Swamp into my graveyard. Cal plays a Plains and casts Austere Command, choosing to destroy all creatures mana value 3 or less and 4 or greater, completely wiping the board except for Noble Quarry, which comes into play when Tolarian Entrancer is destroyed. Once that resolves, Cal recasts his commander Minthara, and at the end of his turn makes a human, a servo, and gets an experience counter. Richard plays a Plains and casts Selesnya Signet, then recasts his commander Stormvald, making Noble Quarry into a 7/7 until the end of turn. He attacks Cow with the Quarry, which has to be blocked by all of his creatures, killing them all, including the Quarry itself. On my turn, I play a Darkwater Catacombs, then recast my commander Umbris, making Richard exile cards from the top of his library until he exiles a land, exiling only one card. Then in my end step, I exile Umbris and return it to play, and again target Richard, this time exiling 5 cards. Cow, once again, recasts his commander Minthara, then in his end step he makes another human token and transforms Wedding Announcement into Wedding Festivity, giving all his creatures +1/+1. Richard plays a forest and casts Grazilax Illithid Scholar, letting him draw a card whenever one or more creatures he controls deals combat damage to an opponent, and also lets him return a creature he controls to his hand whenever it becomes blocked. This draws him a card with Takasia's Welcome, then he casts Sylvan Basilisk, which destroys any creature that blocks it, and casts Venomous Dragonfly, which destroys any creature that blocks or becomes blocked by it at the end of combat. Finally, he casts Banalish Hero, which has Banding. On my turn, I play a Swamp and cast Chasm Skulker, triggering Umbris and exiling 2 cards from Richard's library. Then in my end step, I exile Umbris, this time targeting Cow, and exiling 5 cards from his library. Cow plays a Swamp and casts Dockside Chef, letting him pay 2 mana to sacrifice an artifact or creature to draw a card, which he immediately does, sacrificing both his Talisman of Hierarchy and Orzhov's Signet to draw 2 cards. After that, he casts Zulaport Cutthroat, making each opponent lose a life while Cow gains a life whenever one of his creatures dies. He also casts a Spawning Pit, and then plays a Bajuka Bog, exiling my graveyard. Unfortunately, he couldn't have done that since he'd already played a land this turn. He moves to combat, attacking Richard for 9 with his human token, but Richard blocks with the Banalish Hero, killing it and taking no damage. At the end of turn, Cow makes another servo. On Richard's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Heliod's Intervention for X=3, destroying 3 artifacts and or enchantments, targeting Cow's Spawning Pit, Wedding Festivity, and Hidden Stockpile. In response, Cow sacrifices the Spawning Pit with Dockside Chef, drawing a card, then the rest are destroyed. Once that resolves, Richard casts Nemesis Mask, equipping it to Sylvan Basilisk, forcing all creatures to block it if able. He moves to combat, attacking me for 14 with the Basilisk and Stormvald, after triggering Stormvald on attacks to turn the Basilisk into a 7/7. I'm then forced to block the Basilisk with Umbris and the Chasm Skulker. However, when the trigger to destroy them goes on the stack, I cast Essence Flux, exiling Umbris and returning it to the battlefield, targeting Richard with its ability and exiling 2 cards from his library. However, I do still take 7 damage from Stormvald, Richard draws a card, and the Chasm Skulker dies. In his second main phase, he cast Welcoming Vampire, drawing a card when a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under his control, triggering Takasia's Welcome and drawing a card. I play a Swamp and cast Archaeomancer, returning an instant or sorcery, in this case Essence Flux, from my graveyard to my hand when it enters. Then at the end of turn, I exile Umbris with Thassa's ability, returning it to play and exiling 1 card from the top of Cow's library. On Cow's turn, he sacrifices a servo to draw a card with Dockside Chef, and then also makes each opponent lose a life while he gains a life. Then at the end of his turn, Cow gets another experience counter. On Richard's turn, he cast Wild Pear, letting him search his library for a creature with the same total power and toughness of any creature he cast from his hand, putting that creature into play. He then casts Trophy Mage, searching his library for an artifact that costs 3 mana, putting it into his hand, but unfortunately he fails to find. This does though trigger Wild Pair, letting him search his library for a creature with total power and toughness equaling 4, which ends up being Runetail Kitsune Ascendant, putting it into play. Finally, this also has him draw 2 cards and transform the Runetail, since he has more than 30 life, transforming it into Runetail's essence, preventing all damage that would be dealt to creatures he controls. He moves to combat, attacking me with Stormvault, Grazilax, and the Basilisk, but before damage, I cast Aetherize, returning all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. Then, in his second main phase, he recasts Grazilax and also casts Taunting Elf, which must be blocked by all creatures defending player controls if able, not searching his library with Wild Pair. Finally, he casts Helm of Chatsuk, which can give a creature banding until the end of turn. On my turn, I move straight to my end step, exiling Archaeomancer with Thassa's ability, returning it to play, and also returning Aetherize from my graveyard to my hand. Cal plays a Plains and casts Brilliant Restoration, returning all artifacts and enchantments from his graveyard to the battlefield. In response though, I cast Split Decision, letting each player vote to either let me copy or counter the spell. Cal votes for copy, while Richard and I both vote for counter, countering the Brilliant Restoration. Once that's resolved, Cal sacrifices his human token, drawing a card, gaining a life, and making each opponent lose a life, then casts Grateful Apparition, proliferating when it deals combat damage to an opponent. Finally, in his end step, he gets another experience counter. Richard plays a Yavimaya Coast, then recasts his commander Stormvault, making his Dragonfly a 7/7 until the end of turn. He attacks Cal for 9 with the Dragonfly and Welcoming Vampire, and Cal blocks the Dragonfly, so Richard uses Grazilax to return it to his hand. Then Cal takes 2 and Richard draws a card. In his second main phase, he recasts the Venomous Dragonfly, draws 2 cards, and searches his library for a creature with total power and toughness 2, specifically Timberwolves, which has banding, putting it into play. He also casts Beast Whisperer, letting him draw a card when he casts a creature spell, and at the end of turn, I cast Displace, exiling Archaeomancer and Umbris, returning them to play. This exiles 1 card from the top of Richard's library and returns Displace to my hand, allowing me to repeat this process an additional time, casting Displace, returning it to my hand, and exiling 6 cards from Richard's library. On my turn, I play an island, then move to my end step, exiling Archaeomancer with Thassa, returning it to play, and also returning Split Decision from my graveyard to my hand. Cal plays a swamp and attacks me for 11 with the Grateful Apparition. Since I don't want to lose, I'm forced to cast Aetherize, returning the apparition to Cal's hand. Second main phase though, Cal recasts the Grateful Apparition and gets another experience counter. On Richard's turn, he attacks me for 17 total damage with Stormvault, the Welcoming Vampire, Dragonfly, and Taunting Elf. Before the blocks, I cast Essence Flux, attempting to exile Archaeomancer and return it to play so that I can get Aetherize back to my hand. Unfortunately, Cal has a response, casting Despark to exile my Archaeomancer. This fizzles my answer to the attack, meaning that once Umbris blocks the Taunting Elf, I still take 16 damage, getting knocked out of the game. In Richard's second main phase, he cast Body of Knowledge, gaining no maximum hand size and drawing cards equal to the damage it's dealt. On Cal's turn, he sacrifices as much as he can to draw cards with Dockside Chef, but unable to find an answer, he just dies to Richard's board on his turn, so he decides to concede, winning Richard the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I'm not going to lie to you, that was a very long game. It was about 2 hours long total, and it was quite a pain in the butt to try to edit because there were a ton of different triggers and a ton of different creatures and effects and things going off, but it was a lot of fun. and I really only have myself to blame for the fact that it took so long for us to get through the game, because I tried to assemble a lock where I had an Aetherize and a counterspell every single turn for no matter what was happening, but unfortunately Cal found the exact answer he needed, being able to despark our Archaeomancer right when we were trying to get stuff back. I did have ways in my hand to protect the Archaeomancer, and I could have blinked it a couple times or maybe blinked Umbris a couple of times, but if we're being honest, at that point I didn't have the mana to cast Aetherize, so I wasn't really going to be surviving the turn anyway, and I didn't really want to be dealing with that, so not quite our game, but I think it definitely showed its power, being able to assemble a lock very quickly that was only very not easily broken up. So very, very fun, very cool. But I do think the deck showed a lot of promise, and I'm not going to lie to you, I didn't mention this earlier, but this deck was very heavily based off of my own personal Atris deck. So if you're interested in seeing the Atris deck that it's based off of, let me know down in the comments. Maybe I can do a deck tech on that at some point too. Otherwise, moving around the table, let's talk about everyone else's decks. Going to my left at the table to Luke, the Metamai deck was very, very powerful. I think it was super cool to see him drop Metamai with Double Strike, get 2 additional turns, and then also have Azor to be able to kind of do a Sphinx's Revelation and get a bunch of life and a bunch of cards to be able to then play with on the next extra turn. I thought that was a super sweet synergy, and I think that if he'd been able to get a few more creatures on board, he probably could have survived long enough to probably win the game. I think that the lack of creatures combined with the fact that there was a banding / lure / whatever else it was doing deck and a token deck at the table meant that he really had to be on the defensive a lot more than he wanted to, but still a very cool showing from Luke's deck. Next up we have Cow, and like I mentioned, the Manthara deck is a powerhouse of a deck. By the end of the game, he had 10 experience counters, meaning all his creatures were getting +10, +0, so even his 1/1s were hitting for 11, which really speeds up the clock of the game. And I think that at any point, if he'd been able to push his way through the boards on the table, specifically Richard's, I do think that Cow very easily could have won that game. But, of course, that leads us to our winner in Richard, winning his very first game and very first appearance on the channel, so congratulations to Richard. A very impressive deck, and honestly it was a lot of fun. There's a lot of kind of bad vibes that people get from banding that it's a little confusing. I think most of what I learned in that game is that it just breaks all the fundamental rules of combat, but it didn't seem too difficult to understand, so I would be interested in playing against this deck again in the future, knowing a little bit more about it. But I think that we really benefited from not having a super combat-oriented deck, meaning that we didn't have to worry too much about what Richard was doing. However, not being a combat-oriented deck meant that we really only had 1 to 2 blockers and then couldn't deal with whatever Richard was doing, so, you know, a little bit of hit and miss, but very, very cool, very sweet deck. It's very nice to see something that's very unique and something that you don't see very often. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments what you thought of everybody's decks. Let me know if there's anything you think that I should add to the Umbris deck or maybe take away. Let me know if you want to see the Atris deck that it's based off of. And most of all, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.